It was good meeting you.
Oh, you too.
Okay.
Thanks.
Can't stay long.
No problem. It's okay.
All right, everyone. Go ahead and get started. So welcome to our next Virginia Tech National Capital Region Science, Technology, Innovation, and Policy lecture. I'm Sanjay Raman. I'm the Associate Vice President for the National Capital Region. I'm a professor in electrical and computer engineering, and I also serve as the President and CEO of the Virginia Tech Applied Research Corporation. So our speaker today is very near and dear to our heart because we have been, the corporation and the university have been working very closely with National Intelligence University for a number of years, and they have a strong presence here in the building as well. Before I introduce our speaker, just a couple of housekeeping notes. As all of you know, we have a kind of a rolling reception with food and wine. So after the conclusion of the talk, and we'll do Q&A in here, please stick around if you can at the reception. There'll be opportunities. Hopefully, Dean Holmes can stick around a little bit and maybe have some one-on-one or small group interactions as well. I'll also ask that if you are going to ask a question, the microphones, there's a little vertical sort of cylindrical button that you press to turn the microphone on, and it'll turn red up at the top, and then everyone will be able to hear your question pretty well. So we are live streaming this, so there are, I think, some folks theoretically out there in cyberspace that are viewing this lecture as well. So hopefully both here in Arlington and online. We're looking forward to this very, very interesting lecture. So without further ado, let me introduce our speaker, Dr. Brian Holmes. He's the Dean of the School of Science and Technology Intelligence at the National Intelligence University. It's located in Bethesda, Maryland, so just sort of across Chain Bridge, a little bit further over that way. He received his BS in chemistry with a minor in history. Yep. Very interesting.
It plays a part today.
From that probably comes in handy.
It does.
Current role. From University of Delaware in 1997, and a PhD in chemistry from Clemson University in 2002. He served as a postdoctoral associate at the University of Minnesota in the Department of Chemical Engineering and Material Science. And then he did a 2-year American Society for Engineering Education fellowship at the Naval Research Lab. He served as an all-source intelligence analyst and a branch chief in the Defense Intelligence Agency's Counterproliferation Support Office from 2006 to 2010. While doing all that, he also became a direct commissioned naval officer, which is also near and dear to my heart, and served from 2007 to 2011 as an officer in the Navy. And for 3 years, he supported the Afghanistan-Pakistan Task Force in DIA's Directorate for Intelligence. From 2012 to 2016, Dean Holmes chaired the Emerging and Disruptive Technology, Geostrategic Resources and Environment, and Weapons of Mass Destruction concentrations in the school. He primarily focuses research on dual-use technologies and the translation of emerging research and development into advanced materials for military capabilities. From 2016 to 2017, he served as the Associate Dean of the School of Science, Technology, Intelligence, and as mentioned, he is now the Dean of the school. He received the Deputy Director of National Intelligence for Analysis Distinguished Analysis Award in addition to a National Intelligence Meritorious Unit citation. So please welcome Dean Holmes, and we look forward to your talk.
All right, thank you. Okay, thank you very much. So the first thing I want to do is just make sure I thank the leadership of the Virginia Tech ARC, but not only that, the Virginia Tech community as a whole for holding a lecture series like this. It is rare, in my opinion, that you take what I call the left-hand side of the equation, which is science technology, and you try to marry it up with the right-hand side of the equation, which is policy. It's something that I wish we did a lot more of. So in that sense, I congratulate you for holding that kind of forum. We should kind of talk about these things a little more consistently and publicly, regardless of what the kind of issue is that we're discussing. It's very, very helpful. And it's certainly something near and dear to my heart. So something you're going to learn about today, I think, is what's unique about U.S. intelligence education, and how that marries up and doesn't, to some extent, with policy. Okay? So let me move forward. So when I talked to Sanjay initially about this lecture series, we had to come up with some sort of theme, of course. So what's that theme? Well, that theme is essentially my profession. So my profession is science, technology, intelligence. So it's not really a profession that most people know much about. Certainly not what an analyst or collector does in that realm. Certainly not what education professionals do and work on in that realm. And certainly not what the implications of that profession are in the kind of modern 2018 world. And so I'm going to basically center a lot of my talk around not only kind of who I am and what my institution represents, but also what I kind of consider some milestone events that happened very recently that are centered around what I call the evolution of this profession and what that means for even everyone here. And then last but not least, I will like to point out, since really just the last slide, something in addition to kind of what you mentioned before, but a very formal relationship between my institution and Virginia Tech at a very kind of high level realm that most people, if you've never even heard of NIU, the last thing you're going to know about is that relationship that is relatively new as of last year. And I'll talk about in the context again of science, technical intelligence, so what it means and why it's very helpful for not only us, but the U.S. intelligence community as a whole, okay? So first things first. So the good news is you just kind of listed my background, so I won't. But instead, I'll actually focus on a few themes. So at this point in time, I would suggest in my career I've had kind of 3 mini careers. Right? Each one have been impactful and important all the way leading up to the current one. But it's the first one, and I'll go through each of them, that has been the most influential leading up to what my current job is today. So the 3 careers are essentially, 1, I was a research scientist, like many people here maybe. And in fact, I was a bench chemist. I was a synthetic chemist. Right? I toiled long and hard at the bench. And I learned a lot of things, both as a graduate student, a postdoc, and then in a defense lab. My second career was essentially as a U.S. intelligence officer, specifically as an analyst. And in both cases, whether it was my reserve duty, that was the weekend duty, or as a U.S. federal civilian in the defense intelligence agency, I was essentially what's called an all-source analyst. And all these kind of terms matter in the intelligence world. It tends to frame who you are and what you learn and where you fit in the bigger, broader theme of the profession. And then, of course, my third mini career is as an academic that happens to be dual-hatted as a U.S. intelligence officer. So I am dual-hatted. So I am a U.S. intelligence officer. I am also an academic, a graduate-level academic administrator, and have been since 2012. Now, I mentioned to you before, in particular, it's really my first career that I learned 2 things that I carry with me today and heavily affect how I view and manage and tackle a lot of the challenges that I see day to day in the university, but also with many other duties that I integrate with. I help tackle many of the U.S. intelligence problems that we meet. So those 2 issues are these. So as a research scientist, 1, I learned to value and embrace interdisciplinary research and academics. All right? So although I was a chemist, I'm glad you pointed it out, all the way back as a bachelor's, in my bachelor's program, I had a minor in history. So the way I view that is not only did I value STEM, but I valued what I call social science. And for some, that's literally cats and dogs fighting together, right? In addition, when I was a postdoc, I was a synthetic chemist working in the Department of Chemical Engineering and Material Science. Although not quite social science and STEM, I had to work alongside material scientists, engineers, bioengineers, and other chemists, right? And I valued that. If I could say I had a mentor in life who I never met, or a hero, it would actually be a guy named Neil Amundsen. For those who don't know who Neil Amundsen is, he was essentially he was the name of the building that I worked in at Minnesota, but he is considered the father of modern chemical engineering. And the reason he had such a unique impact as a young department chair at the University of Minnesota is because he had the foresight to not only hire chem engineers, but he also hired PhD mathematicians, he hired bioengineers, he hired material scientists, he hired electrical engineers, and he hired PhD physicists. Now understand this was a long, long time ago when he did that. It was revolutionary at the time to do something like that, and he kind of forced them and retrofitted them into the role of chemical engineering. But that culture still exists at the University of Minnesota, and it's why they've been highly ranked to this day and have such kind of unique and innovative solutions in terms of their research, much like Virginia Tech does. But those kind of experiences heavily impact what I look at now in the field of science, technical intelligence as an academic and a U.S. intelligence officer. I value interdiscipline, all right, to the point where I hire against it. And I look at the students and see who is doing well, and I can almost say, you're doing better than this one because you embrace and can learn from other disciplines. All right, that's uniquely important in my business. The second thing I learned is, I kind of joke, I learned how to fail a lot. So if you ever have been a scientist or a researcher, particularly at the bench, most of the time, no matter how good you are, you fail. Now, what kept me awake at night was the idea that, well, it wasn't really failure. And in fact, it's really just the consistent application of deductive reasoning over and over and over again. And that's important because it's not really failure. What happens? You have an hypothesis, you test it. You learn from what happens, usually shenanigans ensue, right? And then you continue. You have to build and you have to learn and you have to keep at it. And that's one of the primary ways in which you can help solve really complex challenges. Now, most people in this room probably know everything about that. But I would suggest, particularly in the profession of science and technical intelligence, and U.S. intelligence in general, we do not emphasize that enough. We are known at the strategic level for inductive reasoning and even what's called abductive reasoning. We are not known, and we don't emphasize enough, deductive reasoning. They all have strengths and weaknesses. We need to focus a little bit more about deductive. It is okay to fail as long as you learn from something. And so those two things in particular heavily impact the way I look at the world I live in, particularly now as kind of a dual-hatted intel officer and academic. Okay, so that's me in a nutshell. So I'm going to shift. So what on earth and who is National Intelligence University? So I had some good questions earlier. Who is NIU? I've never heard of them. Are you like NDU? Well, yes and no. So part of this talk, of course, is to communicate that, as well as communicate the kind of evolution of our university and my school, whom I represent. So in other words, how did we get to, you'll see it right here, become the center of academic life for the U.S. intelligence community, particularly at the strategic level, and that matters in U.S. intelligence, right? Well, there are several ways in which that occurred. So what you'll see on the right-hand side of your slides is our history. So one of the things I wanted to caveat initially, I actually had on my slides under the first bullet, the first question, was a sub-bullet that actually said, why have I never heard about you? Why is it so hard to get information about you? Well, there's two primary reasons. So the first is we're our own worst enemy. So we've been around since 1962, but we've had 5 different name changes, right? Or 5 different names, each with its own mission. All academic, right? But with a different mission. So when I kind of say to this audience, you know, does everyone know who Virginia Tech is? Yeah, everyone knows who Virginia Tech is. You've pretty much always been Virginia Tech. And you market yourself as such. All the good things that you do, you market, and this is from Virginia Tech. That's just good marketing 101. Well, what happens if you have name changes all the time, every decade? Right? That is not good marketing. If I could throw every dollar in a budget I had, I would ask Congress to never change our name again. So what is hopeful is that now that we're all the way down to 2011, a time period in which we became a university, not just a college, my hope is we never change names again. Right? So who are we and what we are? So first and foremost, we are listed in U.S. Code as a federal institution and technically speaking as a defense school. So that is similar to the National Defense University, which is also an accredited degree-granting institution. That is about where the similarities end, I would suggest. So the federal government, when they create federal institutions using tax dollars, your dollars, they make sure that you are unique. You can't be essentially competitive with other institutions. You have to fill a gap. Because if you were competitive, for instance, with Virginia Tech or University of Maryland, then the taxpayer should ask, why are we funding you? We already have these other institutions. Right? So that's very important for us in our mission. Right? So what's happened is, in 1962, we started as Defense Intelligence School. Our executive agent is the Defense Intelligence Agency. We've always been under DIA. So DIA is a high-level three-letter agency under the Department of Defense. For those that don't know much about U.S. intelligence, the easiest analogy is we're DOD's CIA. Right? A little bit different missions, specifically under DOD, but that's pretty close. Okay? So when DIA stood up shortly after the Defense Intelligence School stood up. So it was right in line. So we've been in existence as long as essentially DIA has. Now what's changed over time is that we've gained, for instance, degrees and we've gained accreditation. Now in our case, we're accredited. We're primarily a graduate level degree granting institution. Right? And we're accredited by Middle States. We actually just went through a pretty brutal self-study through Middle States. Middle States is the same accreditors that accredit Georgetown, Carnegie Mellon, and lots of other institutions. Some you've heard of, some you haven't. They're not a simple accreditor. We're regionally accredited, which is, of course, different from nationally accredited, which is more continuing ed. That's how you look at that. Okay? So here's what's happened. So most important to us. So in 2010, there was a decision, I'll show it on the next slide, that the college at the time needed to focus more on science and technical issues. It's not to say they didn't dabble in it, but there was not the resources and the focus on it. And they decided that we needed more of it. And so initially a center was set up. It was actually one person. It was my predecessor, Dr. Brian Shaw, who's now the deputy provost at National Defense University. And he stood up as a team of one, a center, which then became a school. Now here, these three items in 2010, 11, and 12 are what make us unique. And I'm actually going to go back a slide. It's a little bit hard to see, but something incredibly important happened that ultimately made us the National Intelligence University. There was a memorandum of understanding, an MOU, that was signed between three very important entities. So one was DIA, our executive agent. The other was the Director of National Intelligence, that was Jim Clapper at the time. And the other was the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, I want to say it was Mike Vickers at the time, Mike Vicker. Don't quote me on that one. And what they agreed to was that we were becoming a university, not just a college. And not only would we center aspects of our curriculum and research on defense intelligence issues, but we would actually become what is known as a Center for Common Concern in the U.S. intelligence community, which means that not only do we represent defense, but we represent the full community. That means Treasury, which has an intelligence unit, State Department, which has intelligence, right? A lot of other entities, DEA, FBI, you're going down the list. So not just the common ones you know, like DIA, NSA, everyone knows NSA, right? Most people, yeah. Not just them, but the whole of the community, all right? And that's reflected in our students and our faculty. So that was a unique point. In addition to that, go back down, we gained the authority to offer the second Master's of Science degree, which is the Master of Science, Technology, Intelligence. So all of our degrees center in some way, shape, or form on strategic intelligence, because that's the place we live in. Right? Now here's what else makes us unique, based on instructions and documents I don't have to go into. So because we are unique, and because we fall under the Defense Intelligence Agency as our executive agent, DIA keeps the lights on using National Intelligence Program funding. So that's known as NIP. We're technically General Defense Intelligence Program under the NIP. What you really need to know is that's Title 50, not Title 10. So when you look at what NDU is and a lot of the other staff schools, they are not Title 50. Title 50 means, in a nutshell, national level strategic intelligence. All right? And in an instruction, it communicates that we are directed in our course delivery, in our student learning, in our research, in our discussions, to use all sources of information. So if you look and kind of peel that little language away, that means we can, and you're expected to use intelligence. So to get into our school, our university, you must be either a civilian in the federal government or a member of the U.S. military, including the Coast Guard. So that's one. You must be a part of the federal government somehow, right? Either reservist or active duty, or as a federal civilian. And you must already have a top secret SCI clearance. We do not sponsor it. You must bring it to the table. That is what makes us unique. There are some exemptions, but it is rare. So if you want to know why it's also hard to find anything else about us, is because we're one of the smallest institutions that exist, maybe in the country. There's probably a couple smaller, but not many. At any given period of time, we might have 500 students on the registrar's books. And at the same time, we're probably the only university that doesn't actually list its faculty on the public-facing website. We do list our faculty on a top secret site. All right? So think about that just for a moment. So how do you get in? Why is it hard to find out about you? Those are some of the reasons. Now, one of the things we haven't done and we've kind of decided, and it's part of the reason why I'm here, among other things, is in fact because we need to market ourselves more. It basically reached a point where it doesn't make any sense whatsoever to stay in the shadows in all things. It just doesn't work, particularly as a university, right? And in fact, the U.S. intelligence community is doing more of that too. They've gone more public. And there's even instructions and directives that communicate that, right? We're the same. And this is just one part about it. Okay. So now that you know a little bit about who we are, particularly in U.S. Code and what makes us unique, I will now communicate how that's reflected in our institution. So since we became national level, we have NIU faculty members off and on what we call joint duty assignments. We're borrowing them from agencies that serve as chairs of their agencies. So we have representatives from every U.S. intelligence organization at the strategic level that exists, except for Treasury and the NRO. Treasury's easy. If you know anything about Treasury intel, losing one person actually matters. They're tiny. So we would love to have them, but when you have a workforce that's as small as theirs, you're going to have to work some sort of, I'll just say it, drug deal. But we're working on it. We'd love to have them. They have a very unique mission in U.S. intelligence. At the same time, we haven't gotten NRO yet, and I'll explain that. If you know anything about NRO, NRO is really manned and operated by two other organizations, the U.S. Air Force and CIA. They are working hard on building a better cadre that's more permanent, but that is has a long and ugly history at NRO. And so if anything, we like to say, well, we really do have NRO representatives through the Air Force and CIA. But we wouldn't mind it, right? Because the NRO has a very unique mission, and it is truly evolving right now. They're going to have to really think hard about what they're doing. Those are our degrees, so just another note, our students represent that spectrum as well. We have students from just about every federal institution that you can name, all right? U.S. Secret Service, State Department DSS, agency, NSA, NGA, go down the list. Every single military organization, we have them. Someone asked me before, a very good question, do you have to be a member of the U.S. intelligence community to come to our school? No. The only thing that matters is you're part of the federal government and you have a TSSCI. So we've had general counsels from DHS come and serve. Why? Because everyone as part of the intelligence enterprise, as part of national security, is either affected or touches intelligence, often in a way that you might not even realize. All right? We're part of national security. Okay? So we have 3 degrees. We have a Master's of Science of Strategic Intelligence. That's the one that's been around for a long time, for decades. We have the newest degree that was not offered till 2012. That's my school, the Master of Science and Technology Intelligence. These are MS degrees. And then we have a bachelor's degree, believe it or not, as well as some certificate programs. The bachelor's degree is unique in the sense that what we have is really a finishing school. We probably graduate no more than 30 tops of the bachelor's, but those that kind of know the military, imagine you're a non-commissioned officer and you've been serving and cobbling together credits over time. And you reach a point where after a number of years, you have enough for what constitutes your first 3 years of undergrad. As a finishing school, they can come to us. We only offer the bachelor's degree as a full-time program. You can come in and you can get essentially your 4th year with us. And you come out with a Bachelor of Science degree. It's a very small piece, very small number of the bigger population, but it is important. And we have between 20 and 30 students every single year that do it. Right? The school, we graduated, the highest number of students we've graduated so far is 52. It doesn't sound like a lot. The college graduates far more than 3 times that, 3 or 4 times that. So in one sense, and we have full part-time and reserve programs, weekend programs, and you can determine how you get there through a huge maze of opportunities. Okay, so a little bit more about my school now. So you learn about the university, you know who are our faculty members, you know how unique we are, you know what we look like in U.S. Code. Now let's talk about the Anthony G. Ottinger School of Science and Technology Intelligence. So he's known as Tony Ottinger. He has won just about every high-level award known to man and sat on just about every science board that matters, that affects national security, known to man. And most importantly, I would suggest that for something like a decade, he actually served as chair of our Board of Visitors. And so as chair of Board of Visitors, and yes, we have one, like most institutions of higher learning, he basically recognized a long time ago, 15 years ago, the need to have more resources and more emphasis on what is known as science, technical intelligence at our school. We had a little bit of it, not enough, not focused. And so based on his advice, that is essentially how we came to be, as well as really good leadership from my former boss, Brian Shaw. Okay, so now let's start talking about the theme a little bit more. So the theme, right, is science, technical intelligence. What is that? Well, let me communicate. It depends. Depends on the definition, depends on the context, and to a certain extent depends on the year in which it was defined. All right? So I'm going to offer the first definition for you, and we're going to come back to it. So when the school built up its first set of curriculum, one of the smart things that Brian Shaw did was he actually charged, we'll call it contract, the National Research Council to do an independent review of that first curriculum offering. As part of that curriculum offering, he defined, as part of our mission for the school, he defined scientific and technical intelligence. In this case, I'll let you read it. I'll do it right now. Address threats to national security rising from globalization of S&T, identify disruptive consequences of adversarial technology adaptations, and provide a framework for effective collection and warning. Now, if you're a U.S. intelligence officer, you can read between the lines on what the themes are for this, and I'll point them out for you, right? Because we're going to come back to it. So what did they care about in this definition? So first and foremost, let's actually go to the last part. If someone says framework for effective collection and warning, you can immediately go, that's strategic intelligence. That's just code word for it. Okay, so strategic intelligence, that's the theme. Globalization of science technology, just about everyone's heard of that, right? So that's a big issue, and it's been a big issue for several decades now. Why? Because of the advent of the internet. Either to disseminate the knowledge that people can attain and exploit, to learn about science technology and then adapt to it and use it. So that is an issue, particularly in national security. And then last but not least, disruptive consequences of adversarial technology adaptations. Now that's important in the sense that what they don't say is something involving defense or military. Now that could be included in here, but it's not explicit. So it could be lots of things. It could be economic security that has underlying technology issues. could be societal issues, as well as what we call dual use, like military issues. Right? So kind of keep that in mind. So that is 2011, and that is, of course, in an academic context, but in a strategic intelligence manner as well. All right, so what do we look like? Someone asked, do you have an engineering program? Well, no, we're unique. Congress would hate us if we did that. What do we have? I said before that I value and embrace interdiscipline. So what we do have is, I'll call it, the language of U.S. intelligence as our areas of focus. So in the school, again, we're relatively small, we have concentrations, which are suites of curriculum that all fit under certain higher level learning outcomes if you want to go academic. At the moment, we have 5. It's about to change a little bit. So we have concentrations like weapons of mass destruction. Well, of course that's in there. That is something the science and technical intelligence officers work on. They analyze and they collect. Those officers are generally known as functional officers, working functional areas. This is the language and lexicon of U.S. intelligence. So people in the S&TI profession are also known as functional experts. Right? So WMD has been a long-standing issue that S&TI experts work on. So we educate people on that in the context of strategic intelligence. Everyone should understand the second one, cyber intelligence and analytics. All the buzzwords of the day, right? Everyone's making their money off it, right? So we're all doing great. We probably all have curriculum somehow against it if you're really doing your homework. Again, we do it in the context of intelligence, emerging and destructive technologies. Now here's how we look at that. So we have a course on the economics of technology. So if technology is a unique driver and there are trends in technology, what does that mean in terms of its impact and consequence at a national level? Right? And how is it the U.S. intelligence has to look at that problem? Right? We teach that. We also teach tech transfer. It's a big deal right now, as well as infrastructure vulnerability. We have another called Geostrategic Resources Environment. Why is everyone hoarding certain kinds of precious materials and minerals? You might ask questions like that and answer them. And what are the implications? And then last but not least, kind of my favorite in a sense, information influence intel. It's too hard to say 3 times, so we simply call it I3. So what is it? Now this is as intel-y as it gets. It's really a combination of 3 things. Classic S&TI issues. First is D&D, denial and deception. That's something we care about both on our side and in our competitors' realm. Denial and deception. Second is what we call identity intelligence. That is a very technical-based issue. So think biometrics as an example. So that is having a huge impact in the U.S. intelligence community, both on our end and in our competitive space. And then last but not least, a classic, very kind of military issue, but one we really care about these days is information operations, which essentially influence intelligence. Right? So imagine all those 3 put together in a suite of curriculum with a cherry on top, and that's what you get now. Very intelly. But what you don't see is a physics program, an English program, chemistry program, an international relations program. You don't see it. You won't see it in the college either. Why? Because then we might get in trouble with Congress. Right? So we have to work at this level. Now, if anything you could guess, is this is very interdisciplinary. Okay. But that's what we value. Now, we are small in stature. I said before, you might have about 500 students, give or take 50 at any period of time on the books. But I like to say we are mighty in impact. So sometimes one of the best things to do is actually highlight your alumni. So I found out, I did some digging with our Vice President of Outreach, and we're not there yet, we're close. But in fact, this is about to be the 2nd time in NIU's history in which an alumni, 2 alumni from the university and its predecessors are serving as directors of a 3-letter U.S. intelligence agency at the same time, right? So General Ashley is a 3-star. He is the current director of Defense Intelligence Agency, our executive agent. He is an alumni. There's another gentleman who's been making the news quite a bit and will probably be there more because of how complex his job is. That's General Paul Nakasone. He's U.S. Army as well. He has to be confirmed by the Senate, Congress at this point, to ultimately become the next director of the National Security Agency, NSA. Right? We've actually had this occur one time before, in which we had a director of DIA as well as a director of NGA, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, at the same time. Now think about that. There's not many three-letter agencies that's high impact. So we have two serving at the same time, yet we are tiny. I can count how many alumni we have. Right? There are many more than this. We've had directors of CIA. We've had directors of ODNI. We've had a lot of senior intelligence representatives at the armed services, like the G2, Coast Guard Intel. You pretty much have to go through our school if you ever want to get to the top of Coast Guard Intel. It's mandatory to not only go if you're chosen, but then do well. But we've had some pretty good people, despite one, no one knowing who we are, and two, not being very big. All right? Okay. All right, let's fast forward a little bit now. So let's talk more about what SNTI really is. And at this point, I'm going to talk about what it is and where it's been and what are the implications now. So something happened last December that to me was a very big deal, at least to me, from a personal standpoint and professional standpoint. So every single administration by law has to draft and formalize a national security strategy. If you don't know much about what we call NSS, basically administration prioritizes their primary areas of concern. And then the way Congress operates as essentially the purse and the oversight is they look at that strategy and they look at what the community is doing against that strategy, the federal government in this case. And they determine, one, if you're doing a good job and using tax dollars appropriately, and whether or not you need some help or push back, right? Particularly against those priorities. There's hundreds and thousands of priorities, but at the level that the president sits, you can only have so many. You have to prioritize. So the National Security Strategy came out in December 2017. If you want to know what intelligence officers do when an NSS comes out, because we are heavily impacted by them, particularly in terms of execution of mission and resources, we immediately take the PDF and we do a keyword search for intelligence. That's an easy step one, right? We did that. So there is a section on intelligence. It is a small section. It's only 3 paragraphs. But I noticed something that I thought was incredibly important. So on the last line of the second paragraph, I noticed these words. Virtually all modern weapon systems depend upon data derived from scientific and technical intelligence. So hey, look, that's the theme of the talk, right? So what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is I then, with a collaborator, did some research. We went to archives. And as a dean of the School of SNTI, I should be doing something like this, academic research. And we discovered, this is the first time in history, that that term, was ever in a national security strategy. So to me, that's a big deal. I've said, well, SNTI in some way, shape, and form has been around a long time. And I know we're important. I can justify our importance. But we've never been that important. But what I noticed was no one else was jumping up and going, hey, look. And that was a bit concerning for me. Because to me, this is a pretty big deal. Now, the other thing I had to do, and this goes back to definitions, and I had to determine what definition of SNTI they were specifically applying here. So they're not going to go and say which definition there is, and there are several definitions. Some codified, some not. But again, that affects resources and execution. And so you have to tease it out a little bit. And that's exactly what you did. So if you look at this really quickly, what do you see right before it? Weapon systems. Okay, go figure. Who do you think is maybe responsible from a policy standpoint? Well, we did some research and we said, hey, in 2013, the Department of Defense formalized a definition for scientific and technical intelligence. And if you look very carefully at it, guess what's dotted all around that definition? Something weapons, 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 weapons. So at first glance, if all you looked at was that one single line that we're looking at now in the NSS, it would be reasonable to argue that drafter was heavily affected by that definition, which is different than other definitions, which is important, has implications. And then if you do a little bit more digging, and you look very carefully what the services are doing, the services currently are all undergoing what they call a modernization effort. So what you see is kind of fundamental docs, not all of them, but very good representatives for what the Air Force is doing in the world of ISR, it's very Air Force in their mission, what Navy is doing in terms of what ONR, which is very just down the street, is prioritizing in terms of their research, and then last but not least, what the Army is doing in terms of their operational environment and the changing character of future warfare. Now, there's one common denominator across all those documents that are influencing the services and how they view intelligence, and that is the trends in technology that are, 1, rapid, 2, being incorporated into weapon systems, and 3, being adapted and exploited and used by competitors. So that is heavily affecting how they look at those efforts. So again, if you saw that definition and knew anything about what the services were doing, to include the intelligence piece of it, which is incorporated in those, you would say, yeah, that makes sense. That's probably where they're going, and that's probably where they're going to put all of their eggs in a basket, is on the defense side. Here's where I say but. There are other definitions in some way, shape, and form. So in this case, we're going to go all the way back to 1949. Right, 1949, right after World War II ended, in the beginning of the Cold War. So the U.S. stood up what was known as the Scientific Intelligence Committee, an interagency intelligence producer. And they set it up. It was essentially the precursor to the modern S&TI profession. This was it. This is what stood it all up for the U.S. and essentially our focus on it and the way we resource. And they had a slightly different definition. You don't see the T in there, but what you see is scientific intelligence. And what you want to look at is the definition. So, is that intelligence which deals with scientific potential, activity, intent? Practice deals with discovery of new and elaboration of old, principles in research leading to new applications, to the development of devices and methods which may affect the security of the U.S. So this is security of the U.S. But again, what you don't see in here is specific reference to weapons or defense. Now, that doesn't mean it's excluded from it. It's just part of it. So when they viewed this as an issue, particularly scientific intelligence, it was really as a broader theme. Right? And one of the things I highlighted, if you don't know anything about it and you want to really know the history of S&TI, there was a really famous British intelligence officer by the name of R.V. Jones. And became well known because of kind of comments and expertise he provided to Churchill regarding radar systems, who is known as the father of modern science, technical intelligence. And he also had a definition that I don't list here that mimicked something just like that. So if you fast forward and you take a few steps back and look at the national security strategy as a whole and not just one single line, my colleague and I discovered other things that pertain to us. So this NSS has what's called priority actions. These are the actions we want to prioritize, and we want you, the U.S. government, to focus on, resource, and execute somehow. But we pulled 6 out. There's a lot more than 6. But we pulled 6 out in particular. Said, this is interesting. Look what you see. Weapons of mass destruction. It's a classic S&TI issue professionals have to look at. It's been in lots of NSSs, frankly. Detect and contain biothreats as their source. I would suggest that didn't necessarily have to be carved out from WMD, but there are some aspects of biothreats that are not strictly WMD, like agro threats, for instance. Agro-terrorism is one of them. That's certainly something that the folks in the profession of S&TI care about. The next 3 in and of themselves really relate to cyber threats and attribution. So you probably see in the news all the time, attribution is a really unique issue that U.S. intelligence has to deal with, right? Who did this? How do we determine it? Particularly using not only technology and evolving technology, but in our case, all source intelligence. So not just technical pathways, but other types of intelligence that may include human, open source, SIGINT. Okay? And then last but not least, understanding worldwide science tech trends. Well, that, if you look at it, the National Intelligence Council every 5 years puts out a document. It's public. You can go right to the website. You can read it. They put one out not too long ago called Global Trends, Paradox of Progress. If you look at it very carefully, just about every aspect has something to do with technical trends that have implications in society, in the military, and in other areas like marketplace, economic marketplace, that have implications in national security. So they're highlighting these things in the NSS. So we would immediately argue that, in fact, the best definition that you should use to the whole of the NSS when it comes to who needs to be involved in the execution as a whole is not necessarily that one, although it's perfectly okay for the one little line, but really something more like this. Or, in fact, something a little bit like NIU's definition, because this is far more appropriate. So my colleague and I thought we were very clever. We said, hey, look, is everyone talking about this? SNTI, we're here and you need us desperately. So something you need to know about SNTI in the profession is that since the Cold War ended, we, in terms of capacity, so SNTI analysts and collectors, so the people of the profession, we are small. So much like NAU, we're small in nature, high in impact. But the dilemma is if you're small in resources, small in numbers, the problem is the requirements and the needs, if anything based on the most recent NSS, are going through the stratosphere. You can't get around the impact of evolving technology, particularly what I call technology convergence, which is when lots of different types of technology from lots of different disciplines converge in a way that's unique and synergistic. So there is no way to have a singular expert on one single technology like that. You need lots of them. And if you want to address and analyze the security implications, you better have a few people, right? Because it underlies everything. So who does it? Well, who works on all this stuff I kind of highlighted before? Well, the whole of the U.S. intelligence community works on these issues. So we wanted to highlight that, and we're actually in the process of trying to build a paper, an article for that with War on the Rocks right now. Because we think it's important. It highlights the evolving mission of SNTI and how we really need to look at it and what's happening in the community or not happening. We like to think we're important. That's the way I look at it. Now I'm going to shift to who is an SNTI analyst or collector. Who is in the profession of science and technical intelligence, U.S. intelligence? So this doesn't make the press all the time, even though it should. It's not really what I call clickbait. Believe it or not, the U.S. intelligence community follows the principles of professional ethics to include SNTI officers. Who knew, right? But we do. And there are 7 principles that we follow. Mission, truth, lawfulness, integrity, stewardship, excellence, and diversity. So you want to start knowing who truly is an SNTI professional. You got to start here. This is everybody, but this certainly addresses us as well. Now, the unique issue I also want to bring up is that came out of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. The way in which it came up was because of an activity that occurred sponsored by the National Intelligence University, and in this case, the faculty that exists within the College of Strategic Intelligence primarily, so not the school, who held a workshop in 2012 as an ethics conference to address the development of a relevant and practical ethical code. So we all exist, we all are guided across the whole of the community by those principles, and NIU had a unique part. So that's top level. Now let's go to my level. So I mentioned before how much I value interdiscipline. And now you've seen the kind of concentrations that exist within the school. You've heard about some of the things we have to think about and work on. They are complex, they are broad, they're really all over the map. And so it wasn't that long ago that we made some observations in the school, or I did. And I basically said, well, I'm going to put my academic hat on, and I'm going to try to study what makes a good, in 2017, 2018, a good SNTI student and professional. That's hard to quantify, but it is perfectly academic. So if anyone's going to do it, we're going to do it. And the way this came about was because I noticed, so in the school, if you think about basically the 40 students that come through full-time, a very small percentage are females. Now here's the good news. The females punch so far above their weight. It is incredible. The females, so when I say out of 40, you're talking maybe 6 or 7 are females. The females almost always have the highest GPAs, and they almost always punch far above the rate in the research awards in the school. And so we reached a point last year we felt we had enough data to actually say something about that or learn from it. So essentially we asked our question, why the heck are they so good? And what can we learn from that, right, in the modern world? Now this is important because during the Cold War, if you think about what an SNTI professional was, it was probably someone who was a weapons expert that focused on the Soviet Union, and you did it for decades, and if you were any good, you had a nice long career. Not so today. Just look at those 6 priority actions and start thinking hard about all the diversity of problems that they have to deal with. And we just have a small set of curriculum because we don't have that many students. If we had twice that many students, guess what would happen to our curriculum? Probably go like this. All right? So here's what we learned. So I work with 2 alumni, and I got lots of data from institutional effectiveness. And I married up quantitative data with qualitative data. And we basically learned in a nutshell that the students and the professionals that we need to do well in the SNTI in the current age have to be adept as interdisciplinary leaders, right? So we call it Renaissance men and women. Why Renaissance men and women? Leonardo da Vinci was known as both a scientist and an artist, and he was exceptional at both. So that's exactly what we found. So we had students that came from a strict science background that married up with the folks that had a more social science background, which is exactly what happens when you become an all-source analyst. You end up taking all kinds of strange stuff they talk about in social science, and they merge it in. So you better be open to it, and you better be adaptive to it, and you better integrate it in to provide good output, because that's your job. So we found the scientists are adaptive to the social science, as well as internal to other STEM areas. And the social scientists who we have in class as well are uniquely adaptive to technical issues. And they're able to do it, and they're able to do it very well. Now here is another problem that probably everyone in this room can discuss. Now I'll go quick. If you're a scientist, you probably have this issue. Most of the people that make policy for science don't have science backgrounds. But we're in the same boat. So when you talk about U.S. intelligence officer, we provide objective information to policymakers. They then make decisions. We know that unfortunately, most of our customers do not have the background we have. And in fact, even if they had a technical background, the dilemma in STEM is that everyone has a different term of art. Physics knows the language of physics. Physicists know the language of physics. Chemists know the language of chemistry. Biologists know the language of biology. And sometimes it's not easy to talk between them. And so we had to determine what other factor makes a good SNTI professional. It's someone who can communicate and find unique ways to communicate regardless of who the audience is. That is an art. It is really hard. It is something we have to work on. But that's something that the modern professional has to work really hard on to do a good job, to have impact. Last but not least, last 2 slides, there may be a silver lining. So if you look about midway through the national security strategy, here's a priority action that we found. Attract and retain inventors and innovators. That's all you guys in this audience, right? So I said before, SNTI professionals have gone like this in terms of numbers. We're like down. So part of the reason is it's really hard to compete and gain them, and then it's even harder, particularly now, to retain them. So if you end up at NSA right now, so you're a stud mathematician, statistician, you're great at data analytics, you go to NSA, you get a clearance, you get trained up. Guess what probably happens nowadays after a few years to many of that workforce? Amazon comes in, true story, and then they pay him a whole lot more. So in and of itself, we have to accept what the environment is. It's not like the old days where you're good for 30 years in one little portfolio. But at the same time, what we haven't done very well is figure out how to get some of those people back in after they go to private. So if you look at younger generations, right, most agree that they may have multiple careers, far more than I have, in a shorter period of time. Can we attract them, and then even if they leave, bring them back? So they now have unique experience that builds on the initial experience that then helps us again later in life. So we are not good at that part. But maybe someone can work on that issue. All right, last slide. So this is the third question. There's only one slide on it. So first, now that you actually know who NIU is, did you know that the president of Virginia Tech, Dr. Tim Sands, is on our board of visitors? So not only is that good for our university, but as far as I'm concerned, even though he represents the university, that is really good for me as the dean of the School of S&TI. Why? Because if you know anything about Tim Sands, you know where his background lies. He is a scientific researcher, an innovator, and then ultimately became an administrator. So in other words, he talks my language, right? And he's a very smart person. He's very cordial. He's great, at least what I've seen. So we have a very unique and direct relationship with Virginia Tech based on the newest member, if anything, of our board of visitors. He came on board about a year ago, last year. I think he's attended 2 or 3. We have him every 6 months we have a board of visitors meeting. But he is part of the equation. Hopefully he'll provide smart, independent, objective guidance to the university's school. Our board of visitors have the ear of the DIA director and the director of national intelligence. So pretty big. And hopefully all of that is very helpful for us in our education and our profession. So with that, I'd like to conclude this lecture and then open up the floor in any way, shape, and form to questions from the audience.
So we have time for several questions, and then as mentioned earlier, we'll retire to the reception. Certainly we can engage further, but I'll open it up to my colleagues for any questions. The microphone.
NDU had a center for the, what was it called? CTNSP, Center for Technology and National Security Policy, which they killed about a year ago.
Yep.
So, it didn't have any money. You had to go out and get money. It was a reimbursable type of place. But is there any thought of having something like that at your university to kind of stimulate the merger of those things together? I mean, it was supposed to be kind of go out and get research problems and studies and come back and work on them, by going out and talking to people that have practical problems of the day. Has there any thought something like that to happen?
So a couple of notes. So NDU in particular, so we weren't affected as much as they were. They got really hit hard by the continuing resolution in the numbers is when you talk to them. So lots of programs got hurt pretty badly. But with that being said, I haven't specifically talked about something like that. In our case, the school's case, we literally were just set up. So our kind of 5-year strategic plan is very basic at the moment. It's about to be updated. Our plan was stand up a school, offer the degree, and build yourself out into a consistent organization that can offer a good, robust program. We are certainly in the business. You can see at kind of the top of the slides, we have 3 pillars like most academic institutions. It's like teaching, research, and outreach. I think some of you use engagement. It's certainly not a bad idea, but I'd be curious. I don't know much about it.
Yeah, well, it was a reimbursable, so you had to. Yep. There was no money. They had to go find money.
Yep.
You had to find the problem.
So even the language and how we handle certain things in Congress, there's some things we can't do that normal institutions can. So at the moment, we can't, for instance, we can't go out and get grants. But that's not a bad thing. My faculty don't sit and live and die, publish or perish. Like, I have a really good friend at Virginia Tech in the chem engineering department who had to work hard to get his tenure. He had to publish or perish. Mine do not. But with that being said, there is some movement within the institution to determine whether we want to go somewhere along that route so that we can do activities like that in a little more fulfilling way. Like, how can we gain money in a more dynamic fashion than the limitations we have right now? So we have things like we can MIPR money to people, but we can't get a grant. The biggest thing we do from a reimbursable standpoint, the way we kind of infuse different people and ideas and experts, is that the intelligence community has what's called joint duty assignments. We offer a carrot that most institutions can't. We offer reimbursables. So we will pay their salary to come to us. But again, our budget is tiny. It's just tiny. And we have that limitation. But I mean, those are good ideas. And in some ways, the center, our predecessor, the center was kind of like that. It was a center for science, technical intelligence. It was actually built initially just to be a research center, centered around emerging tech. But someone had the idea to turn it into a degree granting program. So it was there. I mean, the fundamentals are there. I think it's great. I mean, there's too much of a trend around it to ignore it. But we certainly have a concentration built around it, and we have lots of research. But we're tiny at the moment. But it's a good idea over time. Yep.
So how do you promote the interdisciplinarity in your degree program?
Yep.
Is it done through problem-focused research and kind of collaboration around the problem focus? Or do you have people teaching and promoting the actual interdisciplinary skill set? That's one question. And the second is, you lose people to Amazon and to...
Well, the community does.
Yeah,
Yep.
the community in general.
Now everyone knows that they're going to go.
Is that interdisciplinarity highly valued in the private sector as well, or is that something that's more you're seeing on the government and the intelligence
probably,
side?
I mean, I'm going to guess on this one. It's probably more on the government side. I mean, the Amazons in the world are looking for very specific skill sets that are hard to get, like your data analytics. I talked to MITRE of all people, and FDRC. They said, yeah, we're losing everybody. We're the high-level people in MITRE, losing to private. Well, that's good for private. You're getting great talent. That's great. But it means if you're in the national security business, if you're a Fed, what does that mean? Well, if that's the world we live in and we have to accept it, that also pushes the idea that we have to do more outreach with the experts that may exist out there. So that's that piece. So it's on us to be creative in how we build our own background and skill set. So to address the other piece, I wouldn't say it's how do I do this? So one, there's a top-down approach to interdiscipline. If I'm on a hiring committee, I basically push the idea that I need interdisciplinary faculty. So I may line you up under a department chair, but in no way, shape, and form should I expect, there's many to just sit within that realm. And most don't. But I hire against that model. So when I say, look, if this person looks like they're a one-trick pony from a faculty standpoint, or don't have the capability to be more than that, even if they were, then I tell them right off the bat, consider hard whether that's who we want. So in the top-down level, I try to hire people that just already come in with that. Then at the same time, I don't really have to teach the skill set in the sense that the intelligence-based curriculum we have already forces us to do it. So for a good example is we have a class it's a core class every student has to take. It's called MCR 607. It's Intelligence Analysis and Reasoning. So how do intelligence analysts do what they do? And what is Intelligence Community Directive 203, which is the analytic standards? So what you look at very quickly, and you force all this on the students, is it's just about every single standard and everything about it, even though the U.S. intelligence community is funny. We like to take from everywhere else, call it our own, as if we're the geniuses in the room. That's not the case at all, particularly with like the analytic part. But what you find is to be a good analyst and to apply the standards, you literally have to take a step back and go, here's what they're really talking about. This is qualitative analysis and different types of methods. This is quantitative analysis and different types of methods. This is the different kinds of reasoning and when it's applied, which in a sense is not, I kind of joke, the College of Teaching Intelligence is really a bunch of social scientists. The School of STI is a mix. If you talk to the science in the room in their PhD program, they go, I didn't have a mandatory course on research methodology and a whole chapter on it. It's inherently assumed that I applied the scientific method. I'm just going to talk about my techniques in the experimental. But if you look at social science, that is 100% what they do as part of their curriculum. And so our core, because in the university, we have a legacy that's heavily influenced by the college, who are mostly social scientists. That's imbued itself into a lot of the core courses, frankly, that all of the master's students have to take, in addition to what the kind of little tricks the intelligence community pulls in when they talk about methodology in the way in which, for instance, someone who cares about qualitative methods all the time applies something in an appropriate manner. But it's almost just inherent to do it. I wouldn't say we do it more than started talking about quant qual and the methodology underneath and the type of reasoning and how that marries up to Intel issues in very specific ways. So we have to marry up academic theory with intelligence practice is what we have to do. Kind of answers your question, but I certainly I pull an Amundsen with my faculty. Yep.
Yeah, I think it's sort of a related question, and you may have already somewhat answered it, and then a related follow-up as well. What are the credentials of the faculty? We saw where they come from, and you've hinted at doctorates, but is it all PhDs? Is it a mix?
This is where it gets tricky, right? So I would suggest we have a much harder problem than someone like NDU has when it comes to faculty. We have the additional requirement that you must have a TSSCI. So between us, having that clearance in of itself is outrageously marketable. So as academics, the minimum requirement, so we have a posting, is that you must have a degree commensurate with the degree we offer. So you must have at least a master's degree or something like a terminal. So JDA counts, an MBA counts. But it's recommended to have a PhD. Now, we're probably between 30-40% of the faculty actually have PhDs, although Middle States is trying to drive it. But our response is, look, I call them the unicorns. You want someone that has a PhD and lots of research experience and teaching experience. You want someone that's got lots of Intel experience, right, which is hard to get sometimes. And you want someone who's got that degree. And you want someone who's got, let's be frank, a good personality. Because you may have the greatest resume in the books, but that does not necessarily equate to being a good teacher, a mentor. So I'm really scared of that issue. And so that's the kind of minimum requirements. But we go through this kind of messy decision-making with our faculty all the time, because we may say, look, I am more than willing to take someone in cyber and data analytics, it's a great example, that only has a master's degree. Because I am having a really hard time. Look, first of all, who gets PhDs in information science these days? Of course you have them here. I'm joking. I'm just joking. There's not many. And look at engineering. I mean, most engineers predominantly end at the master's level. I know we have PhDs here, but that's the way it is in engineering. So if you want to go oftentimes into teaching, you get your PhD in engineering. Most don't. They have a bachelor's or master's degree. So I would love a great systems engineer who has military experience, intelligence experience, worked at NRO, CIA, has taught before, and has a clearance. Hard.
Okay.
So we have to balance it. We go, what do we do, and how do we then try to develop people?
And sort of the related question, which was going to be my first question, and I apologize if you talked extensively about this at the beginning since I walked in a few minutes late, but how did you transition from academia to to this intelligence environment?
Into academia,
No,
like into
from you talk about you talk about being at Minnesota.
The first career to second career.
Yeah.
It was literally advice from an old high school friend. So I was at Minnesota. I was talking to a friend of mine from high school who happened to, he was in the Marines at a point. And at the time he was working for McKinsey. And I had a conversation. I said, look, I want to find a profession where I can use my experience and background in science, but not necessarily be at the bench and not go a classic route. So for a little while, I thought I was going to do this other route that's kind of well known around here, which is be a patent examiner, which my friends have done at USPTO. But he said, hey, you need to look into U.S. intelligence. I said, what's that? Why would they need someone in science? And he said, hey, do you know Navy's got a direct commissioning program? It's unique to intelligence. I said, why would they need someone like me? I knew nothing, absolutely nothing. It was just good advice. And so I was deliberate. And I said, well, how about this? I'll see if I can get to the National Capital Region, learn more about what this is all about. So I was lucky. I found a fellowship at Naval Research Lab. That was part of the execution based on the conversation. And then from there, I said, okay, by the way, Naval Research Lab is right next to DIA. So I learned about all of them. And oh, by the way, when you work at NRL, you get kind of a low-level clearance. Well, guess what exists in the National Capital Region? Clearancejobs.com. It's great. We have like clear jobs forums in like hotels. You get as long as if you get it clearance, you can kind of get in the fence a little and learn more. So I did. And at the same time, I said, yeah, I'm going to take this crazy risk. And I'm going to become a military officer at the age of 31. But that's what the direct commissioning program was all about. So there's certain kinds of experience and degrees you can get from a 21-year-old or 22-year-old, and then maybe you build up through it, which main services do. But there are far more unique experiences you might get from someone who's 31. And I was that person. So not many PhD chemists with patents and everything in between, in addition to being at that point an intelligence officer and all that kind of stuff. So I became a direct commission officer that way. Again, based on a friend's advice that I decided to deliberate on, and then I got lucky. The stars aligned. Then execute. But I'll tell you right now, all that stuff perfectly aligned to my current job. So that was the unicorn problem. Hey, you need to have heavy experience and lots of degrees in science. And it would be great if you had experience of research at a lab, DOE or DOD. And it would be great if you know anything about military. And it'd be great if you were an analyst or collector in the U.S. intelligence community. And oh, by the way, it'd be great if you were a supervisor. There's not many of those. So I became the first full-time department chair in 2012, and then kind of worked my way up over time. So it was advice from a good friend.
Okay,
yep.
One more. Ken.
Two-part questions.
Okay.
First part, do any of your students transfer credit from other universities?
So we do have a mechanism for it, but it is case by case. You can get a lot more credits to transfer in the bachelor's program than the master's program. And the reason is this. Regardless of whether there's a few of our kind of, particularly our core courses, even some of the electives that kind of look like someone else, one, the credits you have, they better be regionally accredited credits. So that's just an academic issue. At the same time, in U.S. Code, we are supposed to be unique and use all sources of information in our delivery that absolutely no one else does. So you may talk about terrorism, but I'm really going to talk about it. I'm going to pull the SIGINT, I'm going to pull the HUMINT, I'm going to pull everything in between, and then we're really going to talk about what's happening in a way that I would argue simply doesn't marry up in terms of a course and a course deliverable with anyone else.
Hard to find a 3-hour to 3-hour matchup.
It's hard. Now, we don't say no. We don't inherently say no. So we have a form, and students almost every single year say, look, I took this over here. This is what it was. They provide even the syllabus. And then on a case-by-case basis, we say yes or no. It goes to the deans.
The second part, the other side of the question,
But we're open to more discussion.
do any of your graduates ever transfer credit to another university, maybe for a PhD?
Yes.
Maybe at Georgetown
You bet.
or Carnegie or somewhere?
Yes, they do. A lot of the military do that. I mean, it's funny. The military, ever since the Goldwater-Nichols Act, they just love gaining degrees. I call half our military members like degree collectors. They have like 3 masters, and then they immediately go in for a PhD. They do it all the time, and and it works because we're regionally accredited. In some cases, yeah, you bet.
While I've got you online, distance learning? Distance learning?
Complicated issue for us. We talk about it all the time. We talk about blended learning. The requirement must be that you must have the capability to operate at a TS level, top secret level. You must be able to communicate. We're working on it. The cloud, everyone's got a cloud now. The cloud in and of itself, in my opinion, can enable something like that. It's evolving. Yep.
Brian, that was fantastic. I think even though it was about intelligence, there's a lot of strategic planning, a lot of how do we do business better at Virginia Tech that I think we learned a lot from what you're doing, and I think it's tremendous. So again, we're going to adjourn over there to the reception. Before we do that, I do have a small parting gift. It is of sub $25 value, so there will be absolutely no ethics concerns. And so again, let's thank our speaker and thank you, Brian. And please, I'm sure there's some food left over if the graduate students haven't taken it all, and some wine and soft drinks. Please join us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
No, that's great.
No problem.